Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the Penn Museum. My name is Julian Siggers, and I'm the Williams Director here at the museum, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the celebration of our conservation program's 50th anniversary. So this is a momentous occasion, and what better way to commemorate it than with a symposium dedicated to promoting and sharing the truly invaluable work of conservation across disciplines. Here, conservation has always gone hand in hand with education. In the last 50 years, our conservation program has hosted over 90 interns, many of whom have gone on to very successful careers. In fact, 3 of our current conservation staff are former interns. Now, our conservation department not only educates conservators, but also undergraduate and graduate students of our university. We are a research and teaching museum, and conservation is integral to that identity. Conservation enhances our engagement not only with the museum and Penn community, but also with local and global communities. It is, of course, vital to our collection, but also fascinating to the public, as evidenced by the incredible popularity of our public-facing In the Artifact Lab visit, where visitors can see conservators at work on a range of Egyptian objects. The objects in our collections tell so many stories, and these stories are brought to life by the collaborations that occur here every day among researchers, scholars, archaeologists, anthropologists, educators, collection staff, scientists, and of course, conservators. Now, it is this collaborative energy, this synergy, that we celebrate with this symposium. We also celebrate the care that goes into stewarding incredible collections like this one, and we are glad that this symposium can foster fertile exchanges of information among conservators and allied professionals whose work is so essential to what museums do. This symposium was made possible by the generous support from the Kowalski Family Foundation. Again, welcome to all of you, to our colleagues who hail from 9 countries and who work on projects as near as this building and as far away as Sudan and Panama. It is our great pleasure to welcome you, and it is an honor for us to have you here. Finally, it is always a pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Brian Rose is curator in charge of the Mediterranean section of the Penn Museum, the James B. Pritchard Professor of Archaeology and Professor of Classical Studies, Director of the Gordian Archaeological Project, which we'll hear more on later, a past President of the Archaeological Institute of America, a past Vice President of the American Research Institute in Turkey, a trustee of the American Academy in Rome, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In addition to directing the excavations at Gordian in Turkey, Brian also worked on post-Bronze Age excavations at Troy, where he and Lynn Grant met for the first time before he even worked at the Penn Museum. But on top of all this, Brian is an absolute cornerstone to this museum. He received his BA from Haverford College and his PhD from Columbia, and this evening he will discuss negotiating the interaction of archaeology and conservation in Turkey during the 20th and 21st centuries. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our friend and wonderful colleague, Dr. Brian Rose.
Okay, my thanks to Julian and also to Lynn and Nina for inviting an archaeologist to speak to an august group of conservators. And let me say at the outset that really conservators are the true heroes on any excavation. It took me a while to realize this, I confess, but I am now the first to say conservators should be treated like gods. And I will make this point consistently in the course of the talk. As we move through this 15-minute speech, I will highlight the 3 archaeological projects in Turkey where I've had the good fortune to work. And I should add that I've had the good fortune to work in Turkey for the last 36 years, courtesy of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. So my thanks to them, and I'm not sure if we have Janan Hanım present in the room tonight, our representative for the Gordian exhibit, but if we did, I was going to thank her for the honor of coming to the lecture and, of course, being here with us for a month to help us with the Gordian exhibit. So I began working at Aphrodisias as a graduate student in the 1980s and worked there for 5 years. I then went to Troy as director of post-Bronze Age excavations, working with another archaeologist named Manfred Korfmann between 1988 and 2012, so 25 years. And since 2007, I've been working at Gordian. So I've had the good fortune of working in the Northwest, Southwest, and now West Central Turkey. When I began excavating at Aphrodisias, I knew nothing about conservation. Here I am. 1980, and as you look at this image, some of you were saying, he really does look like a man who knows nothing about conservation. And the frightening thing about it was that the director of the excavation, Kenan Aram, known perhaps to some of you, this is again 1980, said to me on my first day, it's hard even to get the sentence out, you will be the conservator at Aphrodisias. And I said, I've never studied anything connected to conservation. And he said, I've left some dental tools on your bed. And really, what we find most frequently are coins. And so all you need to do is to take the dental tool and clean the coins. And just do that, and you'll be fine. I mean, I was also running 2 trenches. I had 80 workmen. I mean, it was an interesting experience across the board. And I also had to put up all the movie posters of films of the 30s and 40s, as you see, because he was a maniac for those films. But I think of all of the damage I did in being a conservator with no knowledge of conservation. The only training that we received at Aphrodisias, and we were under 10 because it wasn't easy to survive on this project, the only training that I received was in architectural conservation, which will be the focus of what I say tonight more than anything else. There was an archaeologist and an architect at the Ephesus excavations, which were not far from Aphrodisias, a man named Friedmund Weber, or Friedel Weber. And he would come to Aphrodisias because we were excavating monumental marble buildings and teach us how to record the elements. And he also taught us something about anastylosis, when you should set up a building, an ancient building again, how you should set it up, what the principles were. He was the first one to introduce me to the Charter of Venice of 1964 and to teach me the rudimentary elements of conservation, admittedly architectural conservation, but conservation nevertheless. He had restored, or Lynn Grant, I remember at Troy in 1990, said, your first lesson is learning the difference between conservation and restoration. He was in charge of the anastylosis of the Library of Celsus at Ephesus, which is really one of the best examples of anastylosis in Turkey. This is the late 60s and early 70s, where he would gather us together almost like a class. There were only 3 of us in this class, but we would sit on the steps, and he would say, here is how I did the columns. I mixed marble dust with concrete so that the additions that I made would be able to be distinguished from the original elements, but not in such a way that it detracted from the aesthetic integrity of the original structure. So obviously following the principles of the Charter of Venice. And I remember him being very poetic about why he didn't finish the broken pediments at the top of the building, why he had left gaps there. He would say, the building fell down in an earthquake in the 12th century, and I've set it back up. And the fact that it fell down, the fact that it was destroyed, is part of its history. So I don't want to eliminate the history from the resuscitated building. And so I haven't included any infill unless I absolutely had to for the sake of stability. And of course, as you all know, one does the same thing with pottery, with objects, with wall painting, whatever it is that one's conserving. The destruction is part of the history of the structure. And this applies also to the other buildings with which he was involved at Aphrodisias, the tetrapylon, where again you have elements missing from the upper section which weren't filled in. And again, marble, dust, and concrete used for the columns became the most popular intervention. Now, he would also show us the other examples of a kind of anastylosis at Ephesus that represented the antithesis of what the Charter of Venice was trying to promulgate. So here are three prominent examples. The Nymphaeum of Trajan at Ephesus, beginning of the 2nd century AD, the Memmius monument, middle of the 1st century BC, and the Domitianic Sebastion, a monument to the imperial cult of the Flavian emperors, late 1st century AD. With these, though this is before Friedel Weber joined the project, as you can see, they wanted to juxtapose the original marble elements with the modern interventions that were intended to look as brutal as possible so that one would have no difficulty distinguishing ancient from modern. Sorry, this is a very touchy, I'm just going to use my fingers. So obviously you have these brutal concrete additions here that are intended to contrast with the marble, the original marble elements. And unlike everything that all of you do, these are not reversible. So if one were to try to take this down and do it the right way, one would be damaging. One would have no choice but to damage the original marble elements. The same is true with the monument of Memmius from the middle of the 1st century BC. And perhaps the strangest is the Trojanic Nymphaeum, which really confuses the tourists who come to Ephesus. Once I followed them around. This was at Friedel's suggestion. He said, follow them around, see what they say about the reconstruction. And so I did, and no one could understand it because there are supposed to be full-fledged columns here between the base and the capital, and instead you have these little octagonal stilts that wouldn't have occurred to any of us to do. But they wanted to set up the building without spending a lot of time doing it, and what they ended up with was confusion that does no justice to Ephesus or Trajan or Nymphaea or architectural conservation in general. So this is where I learned what to do, what not to do at the classroom of Ephesus in the 80s. And then I came to Troy in 1988. Troy, of course, has an illustrious history, a very complicated history. It's been excavated by 4 different archaeological teams, starting, of course, with Heinrich Schliemann between 1870 and 1890, Carl Blagen of the University of Cincinnati between 1932 and 1938, and then my colleague Manfred Korfmann and I between 1988 and 2012, although he met an untimely death in 2005, and his associate Ernst Perniczka took over the excavation at that point. And as I think most of you know, Troy is located at the entrance to the Dardanelles, one of the narrowest crossing points between Europe and Asia, right at the juncture of the Aegean and the Dardanelles, which of course leads to the Sea of Marmara, and then obviously up to the Black Sea. This is an unusual site because of its unusual history. So obviously, there have been many movies made about Troy, some classic books written about the Trojan War, starting with the Iliad and continuing on down the pike. And as a result, everyone who comes to the site wants to reenact the exploits of Hector and Achilles. This was especially dramatic after 2004, when everyone had seen the Troy film produced by Warner Brothers, and they began climbing the walls. Now, this wasn't in imitation of Brad Pitt / Achilles. So this wasn't the first time that they would climb these fortification walls of the Troy 6 period. So these walls are created primarily between 1400 and 1300 BC, the late Bronze Age. They had been climbing these walls for a very long time. As a result, there were a lot of stones missing from the walls because they wouldn't say no. I mean, if they had trouble getting up the walls, they would continue until finally they would pull out the stones, which would give them a footrest and a handrest, and simply scale the walls as someone took their photo with Brad Pitt in mind, or some predecessor. Robert Taylor, someone from Hollywood's golden era. And so this was the first task that fell to us to do. to conserve the walls of late Bronze Age date that had been neglected by the earlier archaeologists and that were in a bad state because of all of the tourists attempting to climb them. So I brought Friedel Weber in from Ephesus to advise us, and this was his solution. Again, he was citing the Charter of Venice, and he said, our infills should be small stones set in conglomerates that echo the shape of the original stones used in the late Bronze Age, so that everyone will be able to tell our interventions from the original late Bronze Age masonry, but it won't detract from the aesthetic integrity of the original structure because the larger conglomerate is echoing the shape of the original stones. And we've done this all over the site. So here you see the so-called northeast bastion and the northeast side of the site. None of the earlier archaeologists had taken care of the foundations of the monumental buildings that they excavated. And this is a very soft, marlish stone that decays badly when exposed to the elements. And so this too, we use the same technique, using small stones set in conglomerates that mimic the original shape of the stones. And again, this has become a kind of signature all over the site. It's the closest we felt we could get to the principles of the Charter of Venice. Sometimes at an archaeological site, there are pressures that come your way that you're not necessarily anticipating. Let's call these money, scholarship, and politics. And I will address each of those. Now, with Troy, as I think all of you know, Troy is 9 cities, one built on top of the other, spanning a period of about 4,500 years. And this is a color phase plan where we've tried to color code each of the settlements by period. So gray is Troy 1, and yellow, this mustardish yellow, is Troy 2, the second city of Troy, dating to the early Bronze Age, about 2400 BC. This is the phase that yielded the famous treasure of Priam, worn here by Sophia Schliemann and found by Schliemann in 1873, making himself and the site and Troy as a concept famous overnight. And this is a reconstruction of what we project Troy to have looked like. So a phase that had yielded in the past phenomenal treasures, and at a point in the Troy excavations where the money began drying up, Manfred Korfmann said to me, we need to excavate another megaron of early Bronze Age date. There's one that Schliemann left intact for history, so for us, and interpreting us as history. And we should excavate that. You see it here, and then here in the reconstruction, and here after its excavation. If we excavate this, we are apt to find another treasure of Priam, so another group of gold, silver, bronze, lapis lazuli, iron, carnelian, rock crystal, etc. That will again make us famous overnight, and the money will come down the chute again. And I said, Manfred, you break it, you own it. We're going to, which is obviously standard principle of archaeology, and you know, as I was saying it, the conservators were behind me nodding. And I said, this is going to be a mud brick structure in the middle of the citadel. Are you sure you want to do this? And he said, yes, we have no choice but to do this because the money is drying up. And so we did excavate it, and we did find a monumental mud brick structure, and we didn't find another treasure of Priam, and it didn't spur any additional donations. But meanwhile, we had to find a way to conserve this, which wasn't easy. What we did, as you can imagine, is create new mud bricks and face the old mud bricks with the new ones. The same sort of thing was done for the ziggurat of Ur in southern Iraq, excavated by this museum in tandem with the British Museum. The facing of that ziggurat, of course, dates to the late 50s, early 60s. And in this case, we did it in the late 90s. But that wasn't enough. This was right in the center of the mound, and it looked right out on the Dardanelles. And you remember what Homer says about windy Troy. Those winds come all the time. They used to knock me over. And the rains come as well from the Dardanelles, from southeastern Europe, over the Dardanelles and into Turkey. And so there was a need for a canopy that would protect the building, even though it had already been faced with modern mud brick. And so this is what Manfred and I had endless meetings about this, and I should add that he was the senior partner and I was the junior partner, so whenever we disagreed, he won. So this is what was created. If you go to the mound now, this is what you will see. A giant canopy over the mud brick structure that does, in fact, protect it from the winds and the rains of the Dardanelles. And it has its own iconography. It mimics the shape of the mound as it looked when Schliemann first came here in 1870, and it replicates the original height of the mound as it was when Schliemann began his excavations in 1870. It also, of course, looks as if a hang glider had gotten lost and fallen on the top of the mound. So I would say that the framers of the Charter of Venice would not be smiling at this intervention. But the whole discussion taught me a lot about what's appropriate for an archaeological site, what isn't, and when you have to make compromises. Now, some of the discussions in the late 1990s and early 2000s focused on the importance of Troy. So that was money. That now we're moving into scholarship and politics. There was a colleague of Manfred's named Frank Kolb, whom you see here, who argued that Troy was a backwater town in the late Bronze Age, that it really wasn't anything as important as Manfred was claiming, that one should just put the Iliad aside, which is, after all, not a history book, but a work of fiction, and acknowledge that Troy was nothing more than a village with no clear trading patterns in place in the late Bronze Age, when you have these walls that are over 10 meters high and 5 meters thick, but okay. And Manfred argued, well, we have fortification walls that are over 10 meters high and 5 meters thick. Surely this is not a backwater town. And they went at it right and left for some years. And what was ironic is that they taught together in the same university, University of Tübingen. So the Department of Ancient History and the Department of Archaeology were headquartered in the castle of Tübingen, this late medieval castle that looked like something out of Transylvania, hovering over the town of Tübingen. And in that castle, you had these two sort of mad scientists who were screaming at each other about the importance of Troy in the late Bronze Age. And it culminated in a meeting at Tübingen in 2002. It was a kind of gunfight at the OK Corral, where on one side you had the Manfredites, and on the other side you had the Kolbites. You can only see the upper half of my head here. And discussions went back and forth, and it was the first academic conference I've attended where there were boos. You know, normally at academic conferences, if you see a paper that you consider questionable, you turn to your neighbor and you'll whisper something sotto voce, but you won't boo. That gives you an idea of the level of vitriol that was part of this discussion. And it all tied into whether or not Troy was Wilusa, a monumental town fortress, really, that's described in the Hittite texts in central Turkey in the late Bronze Age. At the same time as this discussion as to whether or not Troy was important in the late Bronze Age, and I should add one of the other features was whether or not there was an extensive residential district that was walled, that was fortified right next to the citadel. At the same time, Troy was assuming a more important role in political discourse. So in 1999, the president of Turkey, Süleyman Demirel, came to Troy. Those of you who have been to Troy know that the entrance is marked by a monumental wooden horse that's supposed to put you in mind of the taking of Troy as described in the Odyssey at the end of the Bronze Age. And the discussion that happened then focused on whether Turkey should be a member of the European Union. And the argument that was advanced was that Troy was a formidable settlement of the late Bronze Age, and therefore was the centerpiece of the Iliad. And the Iliad lay at the foundations of the European cultural tradition. Therefore, in essence, Turkey lay at the foundations of the European cultural tradition and should therefore be admitted to the European Union. And so conservation, architectural conservation at Troy started to become something different as part of a larger political discourse. And Manfred felt that we needed to conserve the buildings in the lower town, the residential district, to emphasize the monumentality of the site in the late Bronze Age, in accordance with the current political discussion and his scholarly debates with Frank Kolb. Now, this was arguably our worst reconstruction. There was nothing conservation about it. This was in the West Sanctuary, just on the southwest side of the mound, where I spent about 10 years excavating. And the walls of the late Bronze Age structures were built up to an imposing height, or what I would call an imposing height. And I've put the dates on the wall so that you can see how confusing it now is for visitors. So some of the walls that date to 75 AD actually are lower than those dating to 1250 BC. And you can't really make any sense of it. And the reason why is because conservation, restoration have nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with proving a scholarly point and making a political point and using restoration as an ingredient of that point, as a component of the larger discourse. Within the area of Troy, there are monumental burial mounds, which we also, of course, have at Gordian. Jesse Johnson showed you some of them today. The difference is that at Gordian, there are, in essence, no trees. So it's difficult to hide when you're plundering a mound, and the tomb chambers are all wooden and apt to collapse on your head once you reach them. But in the west, the tomb chambers are stone, and the area is very wooded. So we have a bigger problem with tomb robbing in Western Turkey than we do around Gordian, although there is tomb robbing in both areas. This is a region about 2 hours east of Troy by car, the region of Chan. And in one of the tumuli, one of the monumental burial mounds, was a tomb chamber, a circular tomb chamber with corbelled vault, which contained a sarcophagus with a biographical narrative of the decedent on the sides, which was nearly destroyed when a front-end loader, which was working on a nearby highway, enlarging a nearby highway, was hired by the thieves or taken by the thieves. And this is something they still do. They take the front-end loader and they claw at the burial mounds, at the tumuli, until they hear the sound of metal striking marble. And then they know that they've reached the tomb chamber and hope that the sarcophagus that they find will contain something akin to the jewelry of the treasure of Priam, which almost never is the case. But the result is that the sarcophagus and the tomb chambers themselves are destroyed. And so here you see the sarcophagus in question, the narrative of the decedent showing him victorious in the hunt and victorious in battle. And you can see that the front-end loader clawed off the left half of the sarcophagus. And you see Donna Strawn, our conservator at the time at Troy, putting the pieces back together. We did, in fact, put the pieces back together, although, as you can see, it's a testament to the barbarity of tomb robbing, because all of these pieces were destroyed by the front-end loader. And I should just take a minute to say, I credit my education in conservation to Lynn Grant, first and foremost, Donna Strawn, Jesse Johnson, and Cricket Harbeck. So my thanks to those four women in particular for helping me to begin to see the light of day. And I should say, if any of you are students of archaeology, do not leave graduate school without taking a course in archaeological conservation, because you may find yourself in my position at Aphrodisias in 1980, assigned to conservation duties and have no idea what to do. This was an unusual piece because, as I say, the majority of the paint was still preserved. And here you're seeing the battle scene, the decedent spearing in the eye a fallen Greek, and spearing between the eyes the boar whom he's been hunting. So the speared eye motif to unite the two foes, one human, one animal. Donna had to conserve this in 2 weeks because it was found toward the end of the season. And it was encased in mud. It's amazing that no one brushed away the mud. In so doing, they would have brushed away the paint that clung with a hair's breadth to the surface of the sarcophagus. But no one did brush away the dirt, and she was able to conserve this in 2 weeks. And we published this together. Virtually everything that I wrote at Troy, I published with a conservator. And again, to the archaeologists, I just want to say, your articles are always going to be stronger if you write it with a conservator, because they can see what you can't. they can do analyses that you wouldn't think of doing. And so the narrative that you ultimately present is far stronger, the history that you can reconstruct. Now, at Gordian, to which I traveled in 2007, while I was still working at Troy, it also has a colorful and illustrious history with really four earlier directors. Rodney Young, whom you've seen immortalized in the exhibit just outside this room, Keith DeVries, Ken Sams, and Mary Voigt. And you see the location of Gordian, as Jesse said, about an hour's drive southwest of Ankara, and the extent of the Phrygian kingdom stretching from the Sea of Marmara to the Euphrates River, and an aerial view of the Citadel Mound, which is the focus of our attention now in terms of conservation, architectural conservation. Although, of course, as Jesse said, we're also working on Tumulus MM, the Midas Mound, the oldest standing wooden building in the world. So the two areas I wanted to highlight, the Terrace building area, which is the industrial district, and the Citadel Gate of Gordian, the best preserved Iron Age city gate that we have anywhere in Asia Minor. The problem we have with all of these structures is that they date to the early Phrygian settlement, the 9th century BC, and all were burned in a colossal fire, a major conflagration of 800 BC. And so the walls have been extensively damaged, and after they were excavated, there wasn't a sufficient amount of attention, there wasn't any attention, paid to conserving the walls. The emphasis was on new discoveries. And so you're seeing the Citadel Gate here as it looked last summer. In the course of our excavation, you can see the scaffolding that we erected, a gantry crane, and another crane that we were using to repair the stones on either side. And here an aerial view of the terrace buildings or industrial district. One of the problems that we faced with the terrace buildings, and this is also true with the city gate, is that concrete had been placed on top of some of the walls. Now, you know better than I the folly of putting concrete on walls. The concrete will crack as the seasons change. Cracks will form, moisture will get in, it has difficulty getting out, and it will push out, causing them to splay, causing the stones to disintegrate. So we needed to take the concrete off of the walls, and in tandem with Frank Matero and Naomi Miller, the paleobotanist at this museum, we conceived of a different kind of capping for the walls called soft capping or green capping, where we put down a layer of geotextile, and above it we use a frame of mud brick, and between it we use shallow-rooted plants, local grass called poa, and the roots will grow deep enough so that they'll absorb the rain during the rainy season, which prevents it from ever getting into the makeup of the wall, but they won't grow deep enough to interrupt the masonry below them. So it enables the wall to breathe in a way that they couldn't, and also gives it a nice vegetal cap for the visitors who come to the site. That's been very successful for us. And we also, if the wall is badly splayed, use steel cables to keep it together after we've consolidated all the stones that have cracked in the course of the fire of 800 BC. Now, I just wanted to put in one note about the Pebble mosaic, which of course you see in the gallery just outside this room. And this is a shot of the Pebble mosaic being conserved. You see Jesse here, Dan Rahimi from this museum, Charles Williams, Amanda Mitchell-Boyask, one of our conservation interns, and of course Julian Siggers over here, as Jesse was explaining to us her intervention techniques for the mosaic. Now here too, as with the Chan sarcophagus, I said to Jesse and to Cricket, we have to have this done at the end of the season because we have to crate it at the end of the season because it has to go to Penn for the Gordian exhibit, and so we don't have any time. And this I wanted to put in because archaeologists frequently forget how long conservation takes. We have to remind ourselves of this all the time. Now, sometimes conservators are good enough to remind us that conservation does take a long period of time. But again, I'm addressing the archaeologists in the group. Don't take lightly what your conservators say. Listen to them, because they know more about the stability and the structure of the object than you do, and what will be most healthy for it. Nevertheless, Jesse and Cricket did conserve it in an ungodly short period of time, and as a consequence, it's a part of this exhibit. Now, one of the problems we ran into with the burial mounds was not the wooden tomb chamber inside, but the erosion on the top of the burial mound. As you see, there aren't a lot of trees at Gordian if you look in the distance. And so the burial mounds erode if something isn't done to prevent the erosion. Here is Tumulus MM, the Midas mound, and here you see it as it looked in the late 80s, early 90s. You can see how badly eroded it was. Water channels would form, and gradually the mound was beginning to disappear because nothing was on top of it. And that was because there was no fence. It was open to the animals all year long, and they would simply climb the burial mound and eat the plants. And so there weren't any plants that could play a role in preventing the erosion. And so then we put up a fence all around the mound, and the plants gradually regenerated. But then it was a fire hazard, and one of the tourists threw down his or her cigarette, and the entire thing went up. All of the grasses on the mound burned. And so we realized that we had to find yet another manner of intervening to keep the mound from eroding, but not to make it a fire trap. So this was a decision of Naomi Miller to allow controlled grazing. So at the end of September, the mound is open up to, I think it's 45 sheep and 5 goats. And they go up the mound, they eat the vegetation. Meanwhile, the seeds have already blown into the area, and the hooves of the sheep will push the seeds into the ground, and of course, their manure will fertilize the seeds. And then the sheep and the goats are led away. And this controlled grazing has worked very well for us. So we have foliage on the mound, which prevents the erosion, but not so much that it's a fire trap. These burial mounds in the area, of course, are a big conservation problem for us because they're in the middle of farms, active farms. And so we find that the farmers plow closer and closer to the mounds with every year that goes by. So this is a mound very close to Gordian. This is, in fact, Tumulus W, the oldest of the burial mounds at Gordian, 850 BC. And you can see the fields, the plowed fields. And they come right up to the edge of the mound. And in some cases, the plows have gone right over the mound. And a number of these 125 burial mounds have simply disappeared in the course of extensive plowing. So we, of course, work very closely with the local officials, trying to get stronger laws in place that will protect these fields of tumuli, because this is an unworldly landscape that you find in very few other places of Turkey. So far, we've been unsuccessful in that. And we also, of course, in this area have a big problem with looting and with tractors used for the looting. So this is an example of a few years ago where the looters took tractors, a number of tractors, and just bulldozed through the center of the mound, as you see. This is the original line of the tumulus. They didn't do any damage, and they were arrested, but it made clear to us the importance of teaching the local community the importance of conservation, cultural heritage protection, and conservation. So now every year we have the Gordian Cultural Heritage Education Program, where we gather, for 2 years we gathered middle school students, junior high students, and we taught them about archaeology and conservation, what to do, what not to do, because of course we won't be there forever, and we need to make them stakeholders. They need to care about the monuments with the same level of passion that we have. And last summer, we started training their teachers. So all of these are high school teachers. This is a program overseen by Ayşe Gürsan-Saltzman, my co-director at Gordian, and Halil Demirdalan, the deputy director at the Ankara Museum. And they learn the rudiments of conservation and preservation, what to do, what not to do, et cetera. And now we'll include that as units in the courses that they teach their students. I wanted to put in a few slides in conclusion that will take us away from Aphrodisias and Troy and Gordian, but will highlight some of the issues that one faces as an archaeologist dealing with questions of what to conserve or reconstruct and what not to conserve. Indeed, what to allow to be destroyed. When I was in southern Iraq at Ur, there was a question as to whether or not the house of Abraham, which you see here, should be left intact or whether it should be destroyed. This is not the original House of Abraham. If you look at the mud bricks, you can see they're new. It was built by Saddam Hussein in 1999 because the Pope had announced his intention to visit pilgrimage sites from the Bible. And so Saddam Hussein thought that if he built a biblical pilgrimage site or built a House of Abraham, who was alleged to have lived at Ur, then the Pope would visit Iraq. The bombings would at least stop during that period. And the stature of Iraq would rise, as would the stature of Saddam Hussein. So it's built out of whole cloth in 1999. And Abdul Amir Hamdani, the archaeological site supervisor of Nasiriyah, said, I want this destroyed. It's an instrument of political propaganda. And I said, don't destroy it. The State Department photographer caught me as I made this emotional plea. Don't destroy it. It's now part of the history of the site. It's part of the site's biography. Put up a sign explaining how the site has been used for political purposes, but don't destroy it. And you can see from his body language what his reaction to my plea was. And it still stands, but I don't know for how long. So one is increasingly facing difficult decisions like this in the field, and it's not, these aren't black and white areas. They're very gray areas, and it's hard to know what to do. The same here. Monuments to, I don't even have to say it, you've already gotten the point. Monuments to rulers, what should be done with them when, in cases like this? Here are two very interesting cases. This is the entrance to the Al Rashid Hotel, the vestibule, which has a mosaic of George Bush, the first George Bush, which was set into place in the lobby, in the vestibule leading to the lobby in 1992, right after the first Gulf War. And the point was that everyone who entered the hotel would step on George Bush's face, which is the ultimate indication of disgrace in Near Eastern culture, ancient and modern. Would you have preserved this? Obviously, politically, you couldn't. You couldn't, after the US intervention in Iraq, have gotten away with people continuing to walk on George Bush's face in a five-star hotel where the American brass was staying. I frankly would have dismantled it as one dismantles, as Roberto Nardi would dismantle a mosaic, and I would put it in a museum because this is a monument of history. But as you can imagine, although it was treated with great respect in the 90s and buffered regularly, it's now been destroyed. And this is nearby. I took this in 2009. It's a mosaic, a tile mosaic of Saddam Hussein, and the iconoclasts were attempting to dismantle it. They pulled some of the tiles off the face and then gave up because it was too difficult, and then painted a flag of Texas over his face. It's sort of come full circle. Would one preserve this? I talked to service people, to the veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the soldiers in active duty about this. Is this cultural property? For me it is. Is it a monument? It is for me. Would you conserve it? I would. Would I take it down from its public position if it inspired hatred or bigotry or injustice in any way? I would. Would I then put it in a museum with a text panel that explained the injustice that it engendered? That's what I would do. But most of these, of course, are being destroyed, as this has been destroyed. Now, I mentioned the importance of outreach. The Archaeological Institute of America has been lecturing to soldiers who are about to deploy to originally Iraq and Afghanistan since 2004, to the Army at Fort Bliss, the Marines at Camp Lejeune, and of course the Air Force at Fort Dix, and sometimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is me in southern Afghanistan. Again, I was asked to advise on conservation projects, and I kept saying, you know, Ken and Aaron made this mistake in 1980. I really don't know much about conservation. Nevertheless, I found myself in that position again. This is sort of my Michael Dukakis in the tank photograph, because if ever there were someone who doesn't look good in a helmet and a flak jacket, it would be me. But I recognized, indeed many of us archaeologists recognize the need to impart basic lessons in conservation to the soldiers who were deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan. As many of you know, southern Iraq is filled with monumental buildings that are made of mud brick, and so is Afghanistan. And they're encountering these buildings after they've sustained rocket damage or graffiti or some other sort of destruction. What should they do? What shouldn't they do? Ditto with the museum. If you're the first to enter a museum that's been hit by a rocket, what should you do? What shouldn't you do? These were things the Department of Defense wasn't telling them. And so cultural property was disappearing very rapidly. And so we did begin to work with conservators and give them basic training in do's and don'ts in conservation, because they were now our legs. They would be going to areas where we couldn't go. Outreach and conservation education is, I can't tell you how essential it is. I mean, that's been an underlying theme, I suppose, of much of what I've been saying. And one doesn't need to go to Iraq and Afghanistan to do it. Many of us work in museums. We can bring the soldiers who we're going to deploy any number of places throughout the world and use our exhibits to teach them about history, about archaeology, and about conservation. I think this is essential because the wars are not about to end anytime soon, and this is information they need to have. Of course, many of these soldiers come back shell-shocked, post-traumatic stress. And what we found is that museums can be part of the healing process. And as we take the veterans from the Veterans Administration Hospital through our exhibits at the Penn Museum, we talk about conservation and about cultural heritage protection, and they're fascinated by this. And they always say, why didn't the Department of Defense give us this as a component of pre-deployment training? And this is something that we're all trying to do, to convince the Department of Defense to make this mandatory for soldiers in pre-deployment training, because of course that training continues. But you don't have to wait for that to happen. You can bring them into your museums and you can teach them about conservation with the objects in front of you. Who knows when they'll redeploy? Now, of course, there are many areas where we can't go and where the soldiers won't be able to go, and that's why it's so important to train conservators in these areas. And you've already heard today several examples of what many of you have been doing, and organizations like the Iraqi Institute for Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage, where, of course, Jesse Johnson has been so influential in overseeing a program, and many of you have taught at that program, that trains Iraqi conservators. The Penn Cultural Heritage Center has tried to do something similar with cultural heritage management for museum officials in Syria. And of course, earlier today, you heard from Roberto Nardi about his work with training conservators in Libya, Syria, Jordan, and Tunisia. I always like to end with this slide, which is a bilingual sign that was erected above the entrance to the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 2001, when the Taliban were jettisoned from the country. In both Dari and English, a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. And really, all of you are the heroes in this. You are, I always get choked up when I put this slide on. You're the ones keeping the culture alive, and thus you're keeping the nations alive. So if one, maybe this will help me, if one were to look for any heroes in all of these zones of conflict that now surround the world, it would be you. So thank you, and thank you for listening to me tonight. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to attempt to answer some of your questions if you have any. I don't know, Lynn, if you're passing the microphone around for those who are asking the questions. Julian has a question. Yes, the Iron Age gates, the Iron Age Citadel Gate at Gordian. This is a monument from the 9th century BC. Again, the best preserved Iron Age city gate that we have in Asia Minor. And the problem that we experienced, I mean, there were many problems. This was destroyed in a fire of 800 BC. 5 meters of stone and clay was put on top of these buildings. and then new buildings were erected above them. So the early Phrygian citadel gate had to bear the weight of a Middle Phrygian citadel gate, an 8th century BC citadel gate built directly above it. So those walls had to perform a function that they were never intended to perform, and the problems were compounded by the earthquake in northwestern Turkey in 1999, which caused a major bulge to develop in the masonry of one of the walls, actually two of the walls. And there was no way to conserve it without actually dismantling 11 courses of stones, consolidating the stones, and then repositioning them on the wall after cutting back the rubble core. And so that's what we're in the process of doing here. These 11 courses of stones are slowly being dismantled. We had to do this or the entire wall would have collapsed. We conserve them right on the platform, on the scaffold, under the gantry crane. And we, of course, have to do that for all 11 courses. And we've done nearly all of that, and they'll all be repositioned next summer. So I won't say the gate will be as good as new, but at least it will be stable, as it was not. Other questions?
Brian, oh, sorry. I have a comment and I have a question. The comment is that this is the most powerful conference I heard in promoting our profession. And thank you very much.
Yes, you need to thank the organizers of the conference and indeed all of you for such inspiring papers.
The question is, how do the soldiers receive your messages when you were in Iraq?
You know, they were hungry for this information. I've always said the most attentive audiences I've ever had have been those, the soldiers at US military bases and then at the military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. No one has paid that much attention to what I've said since I can remember, although all of you are now looking at me with great interest, and thank you for that. But it's amazing how hungry they are for this kind of information. It took me a while to find the right tack, the right method for teaching them about Iraq and Afghanistan. For Afghanistan, I used Alexander the Great. They needed something that they already knew to which they could link what I was telling them. So Alexander had been in Afghanistan. They viewed themselves, many of them, as following in the footsteps of Alexander. So Alexander was a common subject that I could use in the lessons. For Iraq, when I asked myself, what do they know about Iraq? What they know about Iraq is what they've read in Genesis. They know that the Garden of Eden is spoken of in conjunction with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They know that Daniel was in the lion's den in Iraq. They know that Abraham was supposed to have lived at Ur. That's what they know, nearly all of them, about Iraq. So I began to use, one of course has to be very careful, separation of church and state, and proselytizing is foreign to me, but I realized I could, if I was careful, I could use elements in the Bible as part of my training for them and get them to approach the monuments and the sites with a greater level of sanctity, which was what I was aiming for. So, for example, with the Garden of Eden, I talked about Göbekli Tepe, which is a site known to many of you, an early Neolithic site in southeastern Turkey, very close to the border of Turkey and Syria. So 9,500, 9,000 BC, 10th millennium BC, with the world's earliest stone relief sculpture and clearly a cult site. The site is at the beginning of the Neolithic period, so there's evidence in that area for the domestication of animals and the domestication of crops. And so you have this very advanced site where people are going from hunter-gatherers to farmers, and it's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And what does the Bible say about the Garden of Eden in Genesis? It speaks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Eve is a hunter-gatherer at the beginning. They're picking apples, and then they're farming at the end. They're farmers. And so some of the tourism officials at Göbekli Tepe set up a sign saying, "This is the Garden of Eden." Now, as with any site, or anything. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be marketed well. And so that's the argument they used for presenting the site as the Garden of Eden. And so I used that, making it clear that this is not the Garden of Eden. But as I began to discuss what the tourism officials had done and what was found at Göbekli Tepe, and the link to Genesis that the tourism officials had suggested, there was a new level of interest in what I was saying. And so I began to talk about subjects of that sort with greater frequency than I had done before. Although I think even if I hadn't, they would have had a high level of interest in it. And the problem was that, I mean, it became too much of a problem. There wasn't any cultural heritage training at the beginning of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I remember one of my briefings, I forget what base it was, somewhere in the States. A woman raised her hand, and a soldier raised her hand and said, I'm going to deploy to northern Afghanistan. I need you to give me an overview of Islam and what I should do and not do in a mosque, and something about body language that's appropriate or considered inappropriate, and the difference between Sunni and Shia, and the religious makeup of this area. And I said, I'm an archaeologist. I don't know any of these things, only on a very superficial level. And she said, you don't understand, you are all we have. There isn't any other cultural heritage briefing. So the level of interest is very high, simply because there wasn't anyone who was doing the same thing that we as archaeologists were doing in the pre-deployment training.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think one of the arguments that archaeologists and conservators make against looting and removal of objects from sites is that once they're removed from that context, so much of the information that we'd like to have is gone.
Indeed.
What do you say to soldiers who've perhaps taken this need for conservation to a different level and returned home with archaeological objects?
Well, the ones I speak to were on their way to Iraq and Afghanistan. I was about to say we don't deploy to Iraq anymore. Is that true? I'm not sure. In any event, they were on their way to Iraq and Afghanistan. And so that would be one of the principal things I would say. Do not buy antiquities. Who do you think is selling those antiquities? What do you think they're doing with the money that you give them? The money you pay for these illicitly plundered antiquities is used to fund the insurgents who are trying to kill you. So do not do this. And I worked in tandem with an archaeologist at Fort Drum, Lori Rush, known to many of you, and she produced decks of cultural heritage playing cards where some of the lessons on the cards speak to plundering of archaeological sites, how much history is lost, and that you shouldn't do it. And those lessons, I think, have been taken on board by the soldiers. At the beginning of the war, if you looked on eBay, so 2004, 2005, and you did a search on Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Bactrian, whatever, any of the cultures of the ancient Near East or Central Asia, you would get a lot of hits of artifacts, ancient art, that clearly were from Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, the AIA and many other organizations reached out to eBay and said, you need to realize what's going on. You're the middle person in an antiquities laundering business, and this is funding insurgents who are killing our service people. That was an argument that worked. And when I lobbied in Congress, and people would say, you're urging us to vote in support of bilateral agreements that will prohibit the free traffic of antiquities and the ability of collectors in this country to buy those antiquities. And to the most conservative congresspeople, I would love to say, but that money goes directly to the insurgents who are killing our men and women in uniform. Do you want to support that? And of course, they would immediately back down. It's hard to get away from that argument. So this is something we emphasize very strongly with the soldiers, and I like to think they've taken it on board, and I like to think that the diminution in numbers of antiquities clearly plundered from Central Asia and the Near East on eBay decreased in part as a consequence of what we've been telling them.
Thank you. Any other questions? One last one, or shall we just thank Brian for a wonderful talk?
Thank you. Thank you.